Inside a cozy diner in a town that had forgotten courage, a young black woman did what no one else would. She stood up, not for loudness or defiance, but for one simple reason: justice. She defended someone the town saw only through prejudice. And then the town turned against her. But what happened next? No one expected. Sometimes a small act can change a community. Before we get into this story, tell us where you're watching. We'd love to hear what you think. Hollow Bend wasn't the kind of place people moved to. It was the kind of place people left and forgot. A two-lane road cut straight through its center like a scar. The sidewalks cracked. The storefronts flaked paint like sunburned skin. A once thriving mill town with rusted memories and boarded-up dreams. Every block whispered of what used to be. The bakery that once smelled like cinnamon and yeast, now empty behind shattered glass. The movie theater, letters missing from the marquee, spelling nothing and meaning even less. The only sign of life came from the corner of Maple and 6th, where the faint smell of bacon and strong coffee curled through the morning air like a ghost still clinging to purpose. That was Brooks Cafe, the last heartbeat of a town on life support. Inside, Danielle Brooks wiped down the counter with tired hands. She moved like someone trying not to think. Not about the bills stacked in her bag. Not about the overdue electric notice taped under the register. Not about room 214 of Hollow Bend Memorial, where her father lay half paralyzed, connected to machines that beeped like reminders of time running out. No, she focused on the rhythm, the swirl of the rag, the clink of the spoon in a chipped mug. The hiss of eggs on the grill, small manageable things, things she could fix. She was only 28, but life had aged her early. Her back ached like her soul had learned to carry too much too soon. Still, her brown eyes stayed bright, watchful, alert, unwilling to give up. The cafe was empty now, save for the hum of an old ceiling fan that wobbled like it had something to confess. The breakfast rush, 3 tired farmers and a retired mechanic, had come and gone without saying much, leaving behind lukewarm coffee rings and tips that didn't quite cover the price of eggs. Still, Danielle had thanked each one by name. She always did, because kindness, no matter how small, was the currency she refused to run out of. Her apron was stained. Her nails chipped. Her phone battery hovered at 12%, and her checking account was even lower. But she'd opened those doors at 6 a.m. Sharp like she always did, because this place wasn't just a business. It was a promise. To her father. To herself. To the memory of a community that used to matter. Danielle poured herself a weak cup of coffee, leaned on the counter, and looked out the window. Main Street stared back like a mirror reflecting quiet defeat. She counted 3 empty storefronts across the street. One had a for sale sign curling at the edges like it was embarrassed to still be there. Another had been a hardware store, her father's favorite. Gone now, just like the jobs. Just like the pride. But Danielle stayed, because her father stayed. Because legacy doesn't leave just because everyone else does. 9 months ago, her life had been in Atlanta. A nursing job. A tiny apartment. A future. But when the call came, your father's had a stroke. She'd packed everything into a duffel and came back without hesitation. She thought she'd be gone a month, maybe 2. She hadn't been home in years, hadn't planned to be. But time has a way of rooting you, even in places that feel barren. Now she splits her life between the cafe and the hospital. Flip pancakes. Fill prescriptions. Brew coffee. Wash his hands. Whisper prayers into linen bedsheets that always felt too cold. Sometimes she wondered if he knew she was there. But she stayed anyway. She thought about closing the place more times than she could count. selling the building, letting go. But every time she walked in and saw the scuffed floors he'd laid with his own hands, the chalkboard menu still bearing his handwriting from before the stroke, she stayed. She served. Even when the cafe was empty, even when the town forgot, she was still trying. Even when the people who once watched her grow up now watched her with quiet pity, or worse, indifference. The cafe's bell jingled once, too softly, like a breath. Danielle turned, her practiced smile already forming. But it wasn't a customer, just the breeze. The wind nudged the door open and drifted across the room before slipping away. She exhaled and returned to the counter, setting the mug down gently. Her reflection in the glass caught her off guard. Not tired. Not weak, just determined. The kind of quiet strength that doesn't demand to be seen, but refuses to disappear. Some people said Hollow Bend was already dead, that she was wasting her time, but Danielle Brooks had learned something in those long hospital nights and hollow mornings. Not everything that looks broken is beyond saving. Not every story ends with an exit. Some begin right in the middle, at the counter of a quiet diner in a town most people have already given up on. And that morning, as the wind faded and the first real customer of the day hadn't yet arrived, Danielle whispered a promise to the empty room. Keep the coffee hot. Keep the door open. Someone's going to need it today. She didn't know it yet, but that someone, he was already on his way. The bell above the door gave a dry, metallic jingle. Not cheerful, not warm. Just loud enough to cut through the silence like a warning. Danielle Brooks looked up from behind the counter of Brooks Cafe, expecting a regular. Maybe Joe Whitman, the mailman. Maybe Dolores from the quilting circle will be 3 creamers deep by now. But it wasn't a neighbor. It was a stranger. He filled the doorway like a ghost from another world. Massive, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a black leather jacket faded to charcoal by road dust and time. His beard was thick, unruly, peppered with gray, and his eyes, though weary, scanned the room like a man always aware of where the exits were. But it was the patch on his back that made the room go still. Hell's Angel, the skull, the scythe. The legacy of every outlaw myth small towns like Hollow Bend had warned their children about. Danielle felt it, not fear. Not quite, but a shift, the way the air thinned when a storm was coming. At booth 5, Old Man Curtis stopped mid-chew. Dolores clutched her purse. A teenage busboy stepped behind the kitchen door like he wasn't getting paid enough for this. The man walked slowly toward the far end of the counter. Every step was deliberate, every breath like it cost him something. When he sat, the stool gave a soft creak but held. He didn't speak, didn't demand. Just lowered his gaze like he was trying to disappear, even though his presence filled the entire room. Danielle moved, not fast. Not out of obligation, out of instinct. She filled a glass with water, tucked a menu under one arm, and walked toward him as she would any tired traveler who'd seen too much and asked for too little. "Welcome to Brooks," she said softly. "Today's special is chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes. Coffee's hot." He looked up slowly. And what she saw nearly stopped her heart. Not anger, not arrogance. Exhaustion, sorrow. The kind that didn't come from the road, but from the waiting rooms of hospitals. "Coffee," he said, his voice low, hoarse like gravel. "Black. Whatever you got." She poured it quietly, noticing how his hand trembled as he reached for the mug. Just under the cuff of his sleeve, she caught a glimpse of white plastic, a hospital bracelet. Danielle's breath caught, but she said nothing. She knew that look. The look of a man who hadn't eaten in a day, but wouldn't admit it. The look of a father who sat beside a sick child and prayed to the gods he never believed in. "You've come from the hospital?" she asked gently, setting down the cup. He nodded once. My daughter. Stage 4, Hollow Bend Medical. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Danielle placed the menu in front of him, eyes soft. Eggs and toast on the house while you wait for the special. 6 minutes, maybe 7. Take your time. And that was when the second storm walked in. The bell jangled again, sharper this time, like it knew who was coming. Sheriff Kyle Denton. Broad chest, pressed uniform, mirrored sunglasses even indoors. He walked like the floor should thank him for each step. Behind him, Deputy Aaron Clark, younger, quieter, and always a few steps behind, like her thoughts were catching up. Denton didn't scan the room. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto the biker like a heat-seeking missile. And then he smiled, not kindly, the way a predator smiles when it smells blood. Well, hell, he said, voice rising. Didn't know the circus was in town. The biker didn't move, just sipped his coffee like it was armor. Denton swaggered to the counter, planting one hand on the laminate surface like he was marking territory. What's your name, stranger? The man said nothing. Got ID? Denton pushed. Just making sure you're not one of the fellas we've been hearing about. Reapers moving through, moving things they shouldn't. Danielle stepped in, heart pounding. He's a customer, she said clearly. And unless ordering coffee's a felony now, he hasn't done a damn thing wrong. Denton looked at her, and the smile didn't move, but the eyes turned cold. Danielle, he said, dragging her name out like it was a curse. You really want to put your name on this? She didn't hesitate. I already did. I served him breakfast. The biker moved slowly, reaching for his wallet, but Danielle gently placed her hand on the counter between him and Denton. I said it's on me today, she added. Breakfast is my treat. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Denton straightened, adjusted his belt, and let out a scoff. This town doesn't forget who sides with trouble, Danielle. Maybe this town needs to remember what human decency looks like, she said, her voice firmer now. He didn't ask for a fight. You brought one. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the people, not the air. Then Denton turned, sharp and stiff. Let's go, Aaron. Deputy Clark lingered for a beat, her eyes flicking to Danielle, not defiant, not apologetic, just searching. Then she followed the sheriff into the blinding daylight. The door shut behind them with a hiss. Danielle stood at the counter, palms flat, heart thudding in her ears. The biker didn't say anything, just lowered his head again. In a corner booth, Curtis shifted uncomfortably. Dolores pretended to check her phone, but Danielle didn't care. In that moment, she chose clarity over comfort, truth over silence. And a man with shaking hands and a hospital wristband got to eat in peace. That mattered. That had to matter. Because if it didn't, then Hollow Bend had already died, and kindness was just another name for surrender. She poured herself a coffee, set it beside the man, and returned to the grill. The cafe didn't erupt in applause. The world didn't shift. But something small inside her did. And from across the room, the man whispered, "Thank you." She didn't look up. Just nodded. "Eat slow," she said. "There's more where that came from." The next morning, the sun rose over Hollow Bend like it always did, indifferent, unhurried, hot. But something had changed. Danielle Brooks stepped out of her rusted sedan, keys in one hand, iced coffee in the other, and froze at the sight of her cafe. It wasn't the building. It wasn't the cracked windows or the faded paint that had peeled another inch since yesterday. It was the message. Taped across the glass front door of Brooks' Cafe, scrawled in jagged red letters on a torn piece of cardboard, were the words, "No biker lovers, no troublemakers, The ink bled like it had been written in anger, or worse, purpose. Danielle stared at it, heart slowing in her chest. Not shocking, not anymore. She'd grown up in Hollow Bend. She knew what this town did when someone dared to challenge the rules they never wrote down, but always enforced. She peeled the sign from the glass, the tape crackling like bone under pressure. She didn't tear it, she didn't crumple it, she folded it neatly in half, then again, and tucked it into her apron. Not out of weakness, but memory. Inside, the cafe was silent. Too silent. The kind of quiet that echoed. The air still smelled like yesterday's bacon grease, but the warmth, the soul, was gone. She wiped down the counter, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed to do something. No customers came. Not Curtis, not Dolores, not even Melvin, who never missed a day unless he was dead or in jail. The chairs stayed empty. The jukebox is silent. The tip jar. Nearly dusty. By noon, Danielle knew what had happened. The town had turned its back. And yet, the one face she needed, wanted to see, was still just 10 minutes away. She didn't lock the front door. She just turned the sign back to closed and left the cafe like it was holding its breath. Room 214, Hollow Bend Medical. She'd memorized every crack in the floor tiles of the hallway, every flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights, every inhale of that hospital-grade disinfectant that clung to her clothes long after she left. Her father lay in the bed like he had yesterday, and the day before. Eyes closed, skin thinner than paper. One half of his body is still. But his chest rose and fell, slow, stubborn, steady. Danielle pulled the chair closer and sat down. She didn't speak at first. Just reached for his hand and held it. It felt warm, not strong. Not gone, just in between. Her fingers curled around his. "I think I made a mistake," she whispered. Her voice didn't tremble, but her throat burned like she'd swallowed smoke. She glanced toward the monitor beside the bed. The slow, steady rhythm, the silent vigil it kept over every breath her father managed. She let out a long, thin exhale. "I stood up for someone yesterday, a man. A biker, Hell's Angel. I walked into the cafe looking like I was in trouble, and the whole town stopped breathing. You know the kind. Leather jacket, scars, tattoos, death patch stitched across his back like a warning label." She let out a dry laugh, bitter and soft. Sheriff Denton came in after him like a heat-seeking missile, wanted him out. Wanted blood, and I didn't let it happen. I said no. I said, "He's a customer, just like anyone else." I bought him breakfast, told the sheriff to back off. She paused, waited for his hand to squeeze hers, for his brow to twitch, for anything, nothing. "They're angry," she continued, her voice quieter now. "The whole town. They didn't say it out loud, but they don't have to. They don't come in. They don't look at me. They left me a note this morning, taped to the glass like some kind of damn curse." She reached into her apron and unfolded the cardboard. Set it on the side table next to his water cup. No biker lovers, no troublemakers. She stared at it. "I guess that's what I am now, a troublemaker." Her voice cracked just slightly. She leaned forward, placing her forehead gently against the edge of the mattress. "I keep thinking about that man, Daddy, Tommy, said his daughter was dying. Same hospital, same hall, probably 2 doors down. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for coffee, for quiet, for something normal before walking back into that room." She sat back, eyes damp but unspilled, and they hated him for it, hated me for seeing him as a man instead of a patch. Silence settled again. A heavy silence. the kind you could drown in. Danielle closed her eyes. "Was it worth it?" she whispered. "Was kindness worth all this?" The only answer was the slow beep of the heart monitor. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the ache, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, a flame still burned. Faint, but alive. She opened her eyes, looked at her father's face. His jaw was slack in sleep, but to her, he looked proud. Even in stillness, even in silence, she wiped her eyes. Straightened in her seat. "You always said to judge a man by his actions, not his past," she said. "You said doing the right thing might cost you, but not doing it costs your soul." She squeezed his hand, firm and certain. "I didn't back down yesterday, Daddy. I don't know what that means for tomorrow, but I didn't back down." Danielle rose from the chair. She folded the cardboard sign again, carefully, and this time dropped it into the trash. She stood at the doorway a moment longer, her back straight, her chest full. Then she turned and walked out. No parade, no applause, no witness. Just a woman walking with quiet purpose, carrying the cost of courage and the hope that somewhere, somehow, it would be enough. By noon the next day, Danielle Brooks had already wiped the counter 3 times. Still no customers. Not even a coffee to go. The cafe sat in an uneasy stillness, the kind that followed storms, except this time the clouds had names, addresses, and long memories. Hollow Bend wasn't just ignoring her. It was punishing her, quietly, purposefully, viciously. Danielle leaned against the pass-through window, eyes dry, body tired, soul frayed. Then the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, heart quickening, not out of excitement but instinct, expecting another sign, another stare. Another stone dressed as silence. Instead, 2 strangers stood in the doorway. The man was in his 50s, tall, lean, weathered by years and highways. He wore faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a denim vest with a small silver skull pin on the collar. The woman beside him had long gray hair braided down her back, a vest patched with the same insignia, but her eyes were kind. "Danielle Brooks?" the man asked, voice quiet but strong. Danielle nodded slowly, coming out from behind the counter. "I'm Earl Rhodes," he said, holding out a hand. "This is my wife, Cheryl, Tommy's brother. We wanted to thank you." Danielle hesitated, then took his hand, warm, calloused, firm. "How's his daughter?" Cheryl's smile faltered just slightly. "Grace's condition is critical. They're trying something experimental. It's their last hope." Danielle's heart sank, but Cheryl continued before it could weigh the room down. "Tommy told us everything. About the breakfast. About you. About how you stood up when nobody else would." Danielle gave a quiet shrug. "He just needed food." "A quiet place. I didn't do anything heroic." "You did more than you know," Earl said. "You saw him. Not the patch, not the jacket, the man. That matters." Before Danielle could respond, the distant hum of engines cut through the stillness. A low rumble, like thunder rolling over the horizon. She turned toward the window, eyebrows drawn. "What is that?" she whispered. Earl just smiled and nodded toward the door. "Go see." She stepped outside onto the cafe's front steps and froze. The street beyond Main shimmered in the sunlight. Chrome and leather, black boots and roaring pipes. A wave of motorcycles poured into Hollow Bend like a living river. Dozens at first, then hundreds, engines growling with purpose. Every rider wore a patch. Grim Reapers. Hell's Angels. Iron shields. Leather vests covered in skulls, wings, and fire. And yet they came not like an army, but like a procession. With reverence, with intent, they came for her. One by one, bikes lined the curbs. Riders dismounted. Some carried flowers. Others just walked with hands in their pockets, shoulders heavy, eyes solemn. Earl stood beside Danielle, his hand lightly resting on her shoulder. Tommy told his chapter. They told others. Word spreads fast in our world. You treated one of us like a human being. That doesn't get forgotten. Danielle blinked hard, stunned. There are over 200 people here. Probably closer to 3, Cheryl said. And more coming. Danielle swallowed, trying to find words. Why? Earl looked her dead in the eye. Because when the world turns its back on people like us, we remember the ones who didn't. The bell above the door jingled again as the first few riders entered. Calm, quiet, respectful. They filled booths, pulled up chairs, and leaned against the walls. Every seat was taken within minutes. Every corner is filled. Danielle moved behind the counter, still half in a daze. I don't have enough food for all these people. Cheryl gave her a knowing smile. Already handled. We called your supplier last night. Trucks are en route. Everything covered. Consider it an investment in courage. Danielle's hands shook as she reached for a coffee pot, the weight grounding her. Across the street, Hollow Bend watched from porches, from windows, from behind curtains. Some whispered, some stared. But then, something strange began to happen. They crossed the street. First came Melvin, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes low but purposeful. Then Dolores, then the Henderson twins. Soon, familiar faces entered Brooks' Cafe, weaving through the leather and patches like pilgrims into sacred ground. Melvin gave Danielle a small wave. "Still got those biscuits?" he asked with a crooked smile. Danielle laughed, breathless. "Always." He sat beside a woman with a pink mohawk and a vest that read, "Reapers Never Quit." She smiled and slid him a menu. It was the kind of moment that rewrote history, not loudly but meaningfully. The cafe buzzed with cautious laughter, new conversations, unlikely stories. Old barriers cracked. Long-held fears softened. Danielle stood at the center of it all, apron smudged, heart pounding, and for the first time in days, her hope outran her fear. And as she moved between booths, sliding plates of eggs and coffee across the counter, she felt it. Something had shifted, not just in the cafe. In the town, in the people. Outside, the roar of engines faded into soft murmurs. Inside, something else bloomed, a sense that change was possible, not through anger or protest alone, but through the smallest act of unapologetic grace. Danielle paused, one hand on a coffee pot, the other on her chest, as she watched a retired war vet teach a biker how to play dominoes in the corner booth. And deep in her bones, she realized, she hadn't saved a man. She'd opened a door. And now, people were finally walking through it. By the time the clock struck 4, Brooks' Cafe no longer looked like a diner. It looked like a movement. Every booth was filled, not just with people, but with contradictions, once unthinkable, now made real. A grizzled biker with a cobra tattoo across his neck sat across from Dolores Winters, who, for the last 15 years, had judged everyone in town based on how often they showed up to church. They were deep in conversation over pie. A teen in a school Letterman jacket helped an aging Vietnam vet in a leather vest figure out the cafe's jukebox, now humming with Springsteen and Sam Cooke. And near the window, Melvin Thomas taught a trio of riders how to play dominoes, slapping tiles down with the kind of joy that dared the world to keep hating. Danielle Brooks moved between them, arms full of plates, face flushed from work and wonder. Her shoes ached, her hands shook. But her soul was on fire. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. But this was everything her father had dreamed for this place. The doorbell jingled again, and this time the room fell silent. A man stepped in, broad-shouldered, bearded, wearing a black leather vest stretched across his barrel chest. His beard was thick and white, and on the back of his vest was a patch so bold it pulled all the air from the room. President, Grim Reapers, MC. Riverside. Chapter. Every biker in the place rose. Not with violence, not with force, but with respect. Danielle wiped her hands on her apron and instinctively stepped forward. The man smiled, wide, warm, with a flash of gold on one tooth. "You must be Danielle," he said, his voice low, like the sound of thunder before it breaks. "Name's Duke Franklin." They shook hands. His grip was firm but gentle. Danielle felt like she was shaking hands with a bear who had just promised not to crush her. "Welcome to Brooks Cafe, Mr. Franklin," she said. He chuckled. "Call me Duke, and you've made quite the impression, ma'am. Been hearing about you all over the state. Word travels fast when someone's got a backbone." Duke turned slowly to face the room. The bikers settled back into their seats, but the silence held. Even the locals leaned in, unsure whether this was the beginning of peace or war. Duke cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room like a sermon. "I wanted to say something real quick. Not just to you, Miss Danielle, but to everyone." He looked around, his gaze lingering on the locals, then back to the bikers. "When this young lady stood up for one of ours, Tommy Rhodes, she didn't just serve him a meal, she served him something this world doesn't hand out easily. Dignity." Heads nodded. Quiet murmurs of agreement rippled like waves. She didn't care what patch he wore. She cared what pain he carried. "That kind of courage? That kind of heart?" Duke paused. "That's rare." He turned fully to face Danielle again. "So from this day forward, let it be known, Brooks Cafe rides under our protection." A roar of approval shook the walls. Boots stomped. Fists pounded the tables. The bell above the door jangled from the vibration alone. Danielle stood frozen, lips parted in disbelief. She caught Tommy Rhodes sitting quietly in the back, watching her with tired eyes and a quiet smile. Gratitude, respect, pride. But Duke wasn't finished. He raised his hand again, quieting the crowd like a conductor silencing an orchestra. "And if anyone in this town's got a problem with that." His voice lowered, like a growl wrapped in velvet. "They'll have a problem with all of us." His eyes landed on the one man who'd just walked through the door, Sheriff Kyle Denton. Denton had slipped in during the noise, trying to go unnoticed. But now, every eye in the cafe was on him. He stood in full uniform, hat in hand, jaw tight. Danielle felt the room freeze again, but this time she wasn't the one under scrutiny. Duke locked eyes with Denton, not angry, not aggressive. Just certain, like a mountain that didn't need to raise its voice to be dangerous. Denton tried to speak. Tried to offer something, authority maybe, apology, but no words came. Only a faint nod. His eyes dropped, and for the first time in Danielle's memory, the sheriff looked small. He shuffled over to the counter and sat at the far end. Alone. Danielle, ever composed, poured him a cup of coffee without saying a word. She slid it to him gently, then turned away, because now she didn't need his approval to matter. As the room filled again with chatter, laughter, and the sweet smell of pie, Danielle stood behind the counter and took it all in. What had once been a tiny cafe in a forgotten town was now a beacon, a safe haven. A place where leather jackets and church hats could share stories over fried steak and sweet tea. The town hadn't just changed, it was changing. Not overnight, not easily, not without scars. But today, Danielle saw the power of a stand, of a single moment where silence is broken, where fear is confronted not with rage, but with compassion so fierce it becomes revolutionary. She didn't need a title, she didn't need a badge, she had the truth. She had fire. And now, she had a town that, finally, was learning how to listen. As the afternoon sun dipped toward the rooftops of Hollow Bend, the energy inside Brooks' Cafe began to soften, not fade but settle. What had started as a thunderous wave of engines and fists on tables now hummed with something gentler. People laughed, but quieter. Voices fell into low, meaningful tones. It wasn't a celebration anymore. It was communion. Danielle Brooks stood behind the counter, her hands curled around a lukewarm mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Her body was aching, but her spirit was on fire. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, she felt her father's dream breathing again inside these four walls. And then the bell rang one more time. She turned, expecting another rider, maybe someone coming in late. But instead, Earl and Cheryl Rhodes stood there, side by side, back straight, eyes bright, as if they were holding something sacred. In Earl's hands was a brown paper package, worn, a little crumpled, but carried with reverence. "Mind if we steal a second?" Earl asked. Danielle nodded, trying to keep her composure as they approached the counter. "We wanted to give you something," Cheryl said softly, "from all of us. Not just Tommy." Danielle took the package with both hands, her fingers suddenly clumsy. She placed it gently on the counter and began unwrapping it, her pulse loud in her ears. The paper fell away to reveal a leather vest, black, thick, and broken in from miles of wind and rain. But across the back, in bold, beautifully stitched lettering, were the words, "Brooks Cafe, Friend of the Reapers." Beneath that, in smaller script, one more word stood alone, "Protected." Danielle pressed a hand to her mouth. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her eyes burned as she ran trembling fingers across the stitching. Its weight wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, heavy with meaning. A shield, a banner, a quiet promise. "We don't hand those out," Earl said, voice low and rough. "Hell, we don't even make 'em for outsiders. But you're not an outsider anymore." Danielle blinked rapidly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Cheryl replied. "You already did, loud and clear." Earl reached over, tapping the vest lightly. "Check the pocket." With careful fingers, Danielle reached inside the chest pocket. Folded neatly inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper, the edges slightly torn, the ink faded just enough to tell it had been written in a moment that mattered. She unfolded it, and her breath caught. "Danielle, I've worn this jacket for most of my life. It's brought me respect and trouble depending on the road, but yesterday you didn't see the patch. You saw me. You saw a father with a sick daughter, a man trying to hold it together. No one's looked at me like that in a long time. You reminded me I still mattered. Thank you for seeing me as a human being." Tommy tears blurred the page. Danielle closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her chest, letting the moment carve itself into her memory. Outside the window, the sky turned amber. The kind of light that only shows up in towns like Hollow Bend, where time doesn't move fast, but moments last forever. She looked up and met Earl's eyes. "I know where this goes." She climbed the steps to the back of the cafe, past the old staff photos, the faded newspaper clippings, the bulletin board where customers used to pin pictures and birthdays. In the back hallway, just beside the door that led to the tiny office her father used to call a throne room, he hung his apron, old, faded, stained with grease and time. The name Ezekiel Brooks is still embroidered in navy thread, but it is just barely legible now. For years it had hung alone, a silent witness to what was built. Danielle reached up and carefully hung the vest beside it, the leather and the cotton, the past and the present, the dream and the defiance. 2 pieces of fabric, 2 lives stitched together by something more than blood. By courage, by care, by the refusal to look away. She stepped back, hands at her sides, throat tight with emotion. For a moment, she saw her father standing there beside her, strong, proud, whole, not hooked up to wires, not silent in a hospital bed, but alive and laughing, clapping her on the back like he always did when he was proud and didn't know how to say it. Danielle whispered to the air, "It's yours too, Daddy." She stayed there for a long minute, letting the weight of the day finally settle into her bones. Letting the sorrow, the hope, the healing, all of it, wash through her without resistance. Then, as if waking from a dream, she turned, wiped her eyes with the heel of her palm, and headed back toward the kitchen. The cafe wasn't just full today. It was alive, and so was she. The morning after the vest ceremony, the cafe was quieter but not empty. The storm had passed, the flags had been folded, the engines had gone still. But something lingered in the air, a shift, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. Brooks Cafe had become more than just a place for coffee. It had become a line in the sand. Danielle Brooks stood at the pass window, watching the eggs sizzle on the griddle, her movements fluid, automatic, like muscle memory. But her mind was somewhere else. On the note folded in her apron pocket, the vest hanging beside her father's apron in the hallway, the echo of voices that once doubted her, now returned with curiosity in their eyes. Then the bell rang. But not like before. This time it didn't crash through the silence. It tiptoed. Almost hesitant, Danielle glanced up and saw Sheriff Kyle Denton standing in the doorway. No sunglasses. No swagger. Just a stiff, starched uniform and a hat clutched between his fingers, like a schoolboy unsure if he belonged. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The room wasn't full, but a few locals had taken up their usual booths. Melvin at the back, Dolores with her crossword puzzle. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Denton didn't say a word. He just walked quietly to the counter and sat at the far end, the same seat where Tommy Rhodes had once sipped his coffee in silence. Danielle didn't speak. She grabbed a clean cup, filled it with fresh coffee, and set it in front of him. No judgment, no sarcasm. No ceremony, just coffee. Denton looked down into the swirling black surface. His hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing anchoring him. He didn't lift his head, didn't offer a smile. But after a long pause, he whispered, almost too low to hear, "Thank you." Danielle gave a slight nod, then turned back to the kitchen without a word. And somehow, that was enough. Over the next few weeks, the silence around Brooks Cafe began to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically. But in the same way, a river slowly carves stone, with patience and persistence. The regulars started coming back. Curtis, who'd once glared at the biker in black, now sat near the front, nodding at strangers like they weren't strangers at all. Dolores brought fresh rhubarb pie in Tupperware, placing it on the counter with a muttered, "Still better than yours." Melvin hosted Saturday dominoes like nothing had ever changed, except it had. Locals started sitting beside riders they once feared. Conversations started. Shared jokes, shared grief. A woman who once feared tattoos now cried with a biker who'd lost a son to cancer. A mechanic traded tools with a reaper from Arkansas who knew carburetors better than anyone in town. No speeches, no declarations. Just small shifts, the kind that matters most, and Danielle. She stayed exactly where she had always been, behind the counter, hands steady, eyes open, heart wide, the steady heartbeat of the cafe, and now the soul of Hollow Bend. She flipped pancakes. She poured coffee. She listened to stories about road trips and marriages and good dogs gone too soon. She offered warmth to the tired, quiet to the broken, and food to anyone who crossed the threshold. Because that's what her father had built, and she had rebuilt it, not with bricks or money, but with conviction. The vest still hung in the back, beside the apron. It was never touched, never worn, but it was seen. Every rider who walked in stopped to look at it. Every regular who asked about it got the same answer. It's a reminder of what? What can happen when one person chooses to see instead of judge, to serve instead of fear, to stand instead of looking away. One quiet morning, as the sun rose pink over the rooftops and the cafe's windows fogged from fresh biscuits and early chatter, Danielle leaned against the counter and let her eyes sweep across the room. She saw a woman with a baby on her hip laughing with a biker missing 3 teeth. She saw a kid in a hoodie passing sugar to a man with knuckle tattoos and grief in his eyes. She saw Sheriff Denton sitting alone again, but this time not avoided, just still learning. And that too was okay. Her heart ached with all of it. The pain, the pride, the history, the healing. And somewhere deep in her chest, a voice, her father's voice, spoke without words. This is what a town should be. Closing message, narration voice over. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, in a town built on history and sometimes haunted by it, one act of courage opened a door. One cup of coffee changed a conversation. And one word, spoken at the right time, made a place where people could be seen. Simple kindness can change a whole community. One cup at a time. This wasn't about a fight. It was about a choice. To see people not for what they wear, but for who they are. To speak up when it's easier to stay quiet. To offer kindness when the world chooses fear, because sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with a cup of coffee and the courage to do what's right. If this story moves you, don't stay silent. Like, comment, and subscribe to Injustice Unmasked, where real stories shine a light on injustice, one truth at a time. One act of compassion won't change the world, but it can change a life. And maybe that's where the world begins.